Peace to his memory, grant him rash and vain. 'Twas the heart's blood that rose to clog the brain. No trading demagogue in him we scan, that pith of nations, the bold natural man, whose will may vibrate as the pulses throb, now scare a monarch, now despise a mob. That's a verse from the poem St. Stephen's by Edward Lytton Bulwer, an MP in England in the 1830s, who was a friend of O'Connell, but who also attended the Monster meetings in 1843 and included them in his poem. He wrote, "Once to my sight the giant thus was given, walled by wide air and roofed by boundless heaven. Beneath his feet the human ocean lay, and wave on wave flowed into space away. Then did I know what spells of infinite choice to rouse or lull has the sweet human voice. Then did I seem to seize the sudden clue to the grand troublous life antique to view. Under the rock stand of Demosthenes, mutable Athens heave her noisy seas." You also see the monster meetings being referenced in James Joyce's classic great Irish novel Ulysses. In chapter 7, for example, he pays this glorious tribute to O'Connell's oratory. "Gone with the wind, hosts at Mullamast and Tara of the Kings, miles of ears and porches, the tribune's words howled and scattered to the four winds, a people sheltered within his voice." And I think that last line is beautiful. A people sheltered within his voice. And that's how so many people felt about O'Connell and his oratory, that it did cover them with the cloak of protectiveness, that this was someone who was defending them, who was standing up for them, standing up for those rights here and around the world. He was imprisoned following the failure of the Clontarf monster meeting, following the collapse of that, and he was put in jail. Now, jail, to be honest, wasn't the worst thing for O'Connell. He was sent to Richmond Barracks, but the governor actually gave him his own mansion. And O'Connell was allowed to have his family in the mansion. So his friends and his family were there with him. He wasn't allowed to go outside, but he had the full run of the prison. He exercised every day and he recuperated his strength. What ate away at him was the fact that the government had acted in this way, the way they had declared the meetings illegal, the way they had rigged the court to put him in jail. But prison life itself was pretty easy. And food was sent from all corners of Ireland so that he would have his choice of pheasants, ducks, the best of beef, the best of eggs, the best of cheese, the best of chocolate. So again, he was able to recover his strengths. And the House of Lords in Britain ended up reopening the case. And they ended up squashing the conviction because they said that if this judgment is allowed stand, and in the way it was procured, with the names of the Catholic jurors disappearing, then justice in Ireland will become a mockery, a snare, and a delusion. And so O'Connell was released. And to give a sense of what that meant to the Irish people, they built this huge carriage, a 3-story carriage for him and his family, and a harpist on the bottom. And they had him get into this carriage when he left the prison. And they brought him in that carriage all the way around Dublin city centre. And millions of people were on the streets cheering him. And when he got to College Green, the site of the old House of Commons, he took off his repeal cap that he was still wearing. And he took it off. And 3 times he saluted that building. And the crowds cheered. And O'Connell was back. But in a way, the repeal movement was never as strong again, because there was a younger element, the ones that he named Young Ireland. He was representing old Ireland and her values. Well, this was Young Ireland, similar to Mazzini's Young Italy and the Young European movements around the continent, who believed in a more romantic kind of nationalism, who were prepared to consider violent forms of agitation. And they believed that O'Connell, well, was past it, that it was time for a younger generation to take over, namely themselves, and they didn't like O'Connell. And O'Connell found increasingly his leadership being challenged. And one of the men who we'll be looking at next week was Thomas Davis. Now, Thomas Davis was a brilliant young man, a Trinity graduate, a debater. He had been auditor of this debating society, the College Historical Society. And he thought that he was better than O'Connell. It was time for O'Connell to move on. And they clashed at a debate over an education bill that O'Connell was opposing. And Davis used it as an opportunity to attack a young supporter of O'Connell who was a bit of a rogue. And he attacked him. He said, oh, well, we have comments here by my young Catholic friend, my excellent Catholic friend, my great Catholic friend here. And O'Connell stood up in a rage. And he turned to Davis and he said, what's wrong with being a Catholic? And Davis was taken aback and he said, nothing. Nothing's wrong. And O'Connell said, well, clearly you think there's something wrong with being a Catholic, with the way you keep repeating the word, with the way you keep saying my young Catholic friend, my excellent Catholic friend, my great Catholic friend. You clearly think there's something wrong with being a Catholic. And Davis used the line which you should never use when accused of prejudice. He said, oh no, some of my best friends are Catholic. And he was beaten. And he was so confused, he lost the run of what he was saying. He ended up switching sides in his speech so that he agreed with O'Connell. And in the end, he just broke down in tears. And O'Connell, the great showman, went over to him, clasped him in a big, great bear hug and said, ah, Davis, you know I love you. And some of Davis's friends later teased him about it, the fact that he had broken down in tears, and began singing a song at him. You must not weep for Ireland, dear son. You must not weep for Ireland. But that was the end of Davis. He got scarlet fever, nothing to do with the fight with O'Connell, and died. And O'Connell from Derrynane down in Kerry wrote an eloquent tribute saying, my heart is breaking. Ireland has lost a great friend of nationality. But whether he really thought that is another thing. And the Young Ireland movement now, without their spiritual leader, really began to turn on O'Connell. And especially his insistence that force would never be considered, that he would never consider the use of violence. And when O'Connell insisted on a pledge in that direction, they decided to secede. They left his repeal movement. And the repeal movement from 1845 on was split, was splintered, was never to be strong again. But in a way, O'Connell didn't mind. Because, not that he still didn't want repeal, but because his mind was elsewhere. He saw what was coming. Because in September 1845, a potato blight hit Ireland. The potato crop was destroyed. And so many Irish people were reliant on this. And O'Connell realised that this was an approaching catastrophe. And he devoted all his energies into working for this, to seeing what had to be done, what could be done. He began studying the weather and meteorological conditions to try and investigate what was happening. He joined various relief commissions and he devoted all his energies into that. And he began telling people, you know, this is the time for Britain to show that it could rule Ireland. Because if they would govern justly here, well, then that would be a good sign. That would mean we didn't need our own Irish Parliament. But instead, as the famine got worse, it convinced him that, in fact, this showed the failure of British policy in Ireland. This showed why an Irish Parliament was needed, because it would have seen the plight of the starving Irish, and it would have done something about it. So, becoming increasingly upset about this, he spent all of 1846 working on solutions. He used his own money to import grain into Ireland so he could feed his own starving tenants. He used his own money to try and feed the poor in Kerry. And then he tried to persuade the British to use their resources to try and help the starving. And his friends would look at him and say, O'Connell, you're dying. Your voice is going. You're shrinking away physically in front of us. I don't think you have long to live. And he would tell them, no, I know I'm dying, but I'm conserving my strength. I have one great speech left in me, and I will make that speech, and I will save my people. And so, at the start of 1847, he decided to go one last time before the British House of Commons, the chamber where he had terrified and terrorised the MPs for almost 17 years. And he would give a speech, not aggressively giving out to them saying, you have failed us. We are starving. This is why we need a parliament. Because he knew that wouldn't work. Instead, he realised he would have to throw himself at the mercy of the British and say, now is your time to show that you are just in Ireland. Now is your time to show that you were right and I was wrong. We don't need our own parliament. You will save us. If you don't, millions will die. Now is your time to save us. And he told his friends, I can do this. I'm saving my voice. I can do this. And he went before the House of Commons on the 8th of February, 1847. And he got up to speak. But his power was gone. His voice was broken. The wand of the magician was broken. And no one could hear him. His voice couldn't project even as far as the first bench. And even though he did his best to work his way through his speech, nothing could be heard. But instead of laughing or jeering, the MPs on both sides of the House listened in respectful silence, because they knew that this was the last speech of a parliamentary giant who was about to die. And they watched him on his feet as he did his best to try and save his country. And afterwards, O'Connell was brokenhearted. And he said, that's it, I'm done. And he decided to set out to the continent, go to France, and then go to Rome to get a blessing from the Pope before he died. And his speech was reconstructed from the accounts that he had prepared before, that his friends helped put together. So in Hansard, the official version of the House of Commons, it begins uniquely, Mr. O'Connell was understood to have said. Not that he had said, but he was understood to have said. But he was brokenhearted. He felt that he had failed his people. He felt that in the moment of their greatest crisis, he had not been able to save them. And he was tormented with nightmares in his final months. He only got as far as Genoa. And there he would wake up in the middle of the night saying, I have the Union. I have repeal. I have it in a box. I will get it now. And then wake up and discover it was just a nightmare. And he became increasingly tormented, feeling he would be buried alive, and telling them, check to make sure I am dead before I am put in the coffin. And on the night of the 15th of May, tormented, broken-hearted, in despair, Daniel O'Connell died. And his body was brought back to Dublin. Apparently his last request was that his heart would be buried in Rome, his body in Ireland, and that was followed. And his body was brought back. And even though Ireland was in the midst of a famine, again the people came out to pay their respects to the liberator. And in later years, a huge tower was erected to his memory over his crypt at Glasnevin Cemetery, the cemetery he had helped found. And Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, called this the soaring tower, the soaring tribute, the towering tribute to Daniel O'Connell and his legacy in Ireland. And so many people then, in the years ahead, paid tribute to O'Connell as a great Irish leader. Charles de Gaulle, the great French leader, had Daniel O'Connell as his hero when he was growing up, because Charles de Gaulle's grandmother wrote a biography of Daniel O'Connell. And Charles de Gaulle loved reading about this tall, heroic figure who would one day liberate his country, and it became a great inspiration for him. And when Charles de Gaulle resigned as the president of the Fifth Republic in the late 1960s, the first place he went to was Kerry, because he wanted to go to Daniel O'Connell's house at Derrynane and write in the visitor's book in honour of the liberator. In the late 19th century, when Jules Verne wrote his classic novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, he included Daniel O'Connell in the chapter when he described how Captain Nemo had all the pictures of the great leaders of history in his stateroom. He had George Washington, the founder of the American Union, written under. Abraham Lincoln, and underneath was, who fell shot by a supporter of slavery. And then they had a portrait of Daniel O'Connell, and underneath it, the defender of Ireland. And what's funny is that when that novel was translated into English, the English translator left out the inclusion of Daniel O'Connell. And it's only in the last number of years that the English version of that novel includes Daniel O'Connell in it. Other great figures in the 19th century and 20th century were influenced by Daniel O'Connell. They said he taught a nation and it arose. He created a people that were on its knees and he gave them new life. He gave them hope. He gave them inspiration. He proved an inspiration to people who would fight similar peaceful movements throughout the world, because he showed what could be achieved without resorting to the bomb or resorting to the gun. And that inspired millions outside of Ireland, all across the world. Eamon de Valera, when he became President of Ireland, he was there for the opening of Derrynane as a national museum in 1967. And he admitted that his generation, the 1916 leaders, had been too harsh on O'Connell, that they had despised O'Connell for backing down at Clontarf. And de Valera admitted that they had been wrong, because they would never have been able to achieve what they had achieved in 1916 if Daniel O'Connell had not done what he had done in the 19th century. The way he had dragged a people who were on its knees and gave them back their self-respect. And that's why when we talk about the commemoration of the 1916 Rising and the commemoration of other things, I don't think it needs to be as simplistic. If you are for O'Connell, you must be anti-Pearse and 1916. If you are for 1916, you must hate O'Connell. I would like to think that we have reached a point in our history where we can look maturely on both sides of the tradition and realise that both sides played their part in winning Irish freedom and winning Irish independence. Because Daniel O'Connell was someone who took an Irish people who were on its knees and he convinced them that they were more than slaves. He brought them up, he gave them liberty, and he gave them the freedom to go on then and win their freedom. And that is why I think Daniel O'Connell deserves his reputation as the great Irish leader, as the great Irish chieftain, as the great Irish liberator.